IIS Metabase. The IIS Metabase is where the configuration and schema information of IIS is stored. In previous versions of IIS, this was a binary file, but in IIS 6, the Metabase is now based on XML. And because the Metabase is XML, it offers a few distinct advantages over the traditional binary file. Firstly, it's easy to view and manipulate. Now, being a text file, you can open it up with just about any sort of editor, and the schema can be modified by an administrator with the appropriate permissions. And if it happens to get corrupted, it's much easier to salvage your XML file than it is a proprietary binary file. Now, although the write performance of the new XML file is about the same as the old binary version, it's much faster to read the new XML file into memory, and this translates into faster startup times for your IIS websites. And according to Microsoft, the new XML file is 100% backwards compatible with the IIS 5 binary implementation, so this means that all of your existing Active Directory scripting interface scripts and APIs should continue to work fine as they are without modification. One of the great things about the new XML Metabase is that it supports changes on the fly whilst IIS 6 is still running. That's right, no having to restart IIS because you want to make a configuration change. Now what happens is that a copy of the Metabase is actually stored in memory, and when an administrator makes a change to the IIS configuration, the change occurs directly to the copy of the Metabase held in memory. So when you make a change to IIS whilst it's running, IIS will receive a file change notification from Windows 2003, indicating that the Metabase has been changed, and then IIS will check the metabase.xml file for a value of a setting called history major version number. Now when we open our metabase.xml file, we can see the history major version number here, and we can see our version number is currently set at 6. Now we'll talk a bit more about the whole Metabase history feature in a moment. Now if IIS finds the file with the correct version number here, then IIS will parse the metabase.xml file in memory which has just been changed to ensure that it doesn't have XML errors such as missing tags. And if it does parse properly, meaning the file's good, then it will compare the new Metabase XML file with the old one in the history folder. And we can scroll up here and we can see our history folder, and it will compare it with the ones we have in here. Now if they happen to be the same, then nothing happens, but if they're different, which is very likely, then IIS will write the change to the in-memory Metabase and then create a new history file and increment the history major version number. So in this instance, if we made a change, we'd see this one change here to 7. Now this edit while running feature isn't turned on by default, and you'll have to make that change yourself, but it's a terribly easy thing to do. So we'll go and click on Start, Administrative Tools, and we'll launch the IIS MMC. Now we'll right click on our computer and we'll select Properties. And all we have to do now is check the top box to enable the direct Metabase edit, and then we'll click on OK. And that's it. It's pretty painless, and now you can reap the benefits of being able to perform on-the-fly changes to IIS. Now if you don't want to enable this feature, yet you do like the idea of modifying the metabase.xml file yourself, then you'll need to stop the IIS services first, make your edits to the Metabase XML file, and then restart the IIS services manually. Oh, and one final thing I should mention about this Enable Direct Metabase Edit feature is that if you're the type of person who loves to script everything, you might run into situations where two processes are trying to update these history files at the same time. Now the end result of this is that the process that makes the last write to the file will win. Now the Metabase history feature is enabled by default, and it will store a maximum of 10 history changes. Now you can certainly edit these values if you wish, and you will find them located in our metabase.xml file. Now here we can see our enable history option with a value of 1, and we can see the maximum number of history files that we're going to store is going to be 10. Now the enable history setting simply defines if we want to have the history feature of IIS running. So to disable it, we can simply set this value here to 0. And the max history files simply sets how many history files we want to store before overwriting the oldest ones first. Now here we can see our enable edit while running was currently set to 0, and that's because we opened the file before we actually made the change. So if I go and close this file now, and we'll just go back to our inetserv directory, and we'll just scroll down, and we'll see our Metabase, and we'll open it up with Notepad again. We'll just expand this, and here we can see it's now set to 1, meaning that it's enabled. Okay, now let's go back to our history folder. And you'll probably notice straight away that these history files seem to be in sequential order. But what happens here is we actually have a history major version number on the left hand side, followed by an underscore, and then followed by a history minor version number. Now actually what happens here is that the major version number is calculated, as we mentioned earlier, by incrementing the version number from the last change. Now the minor version number is calculated by one of two ways. Now if the changes made to IIS are performed directly on the Metabase XML file, you'll see the minor version number incremented on the right hand side by 1 each time. If the history file is created because IIS has written the in-memory database to disk, then the number here will always be reset back to 0, as we can see in the case of all of our history files. And this is because IIS has made the change, not me directly editing the Metabase XML file. So this is a quick and dirty way of seeing if the last change was done by IIS or by an administrator. You can check this history folder, and if you see numbers other than 0 here on the right hand side of the file name, then someone's been playing around. Now by now you're probably realizing the importance of the IIS Metabase. So let's move on and show you one of the most important things you're going to have to do as an IIS administrator, and that is backing up your IIS Metabase. Now the first thing we'll need to do when backing up IIS is to back up the all-important Metabase, and we'll do that from our IIS MMC. So we'll go back to our IIS MMC, and we'll right click on our server, and we'll select All Tasks, Backup Restore Configuration. Now IIS will actually produce automatic backups of the IIS Metabase, as you can see here from the list of backups that we have. But to manually perform your own backup, we'll simply click on Create Backup. Now the first thing we'll need to do is give our backup a name, so we'll give it a meaningful name so you can identify why you perform this backup. So we'll just call ours Metabase. Now for extra security, we can also choose to encrypt the backup with a password. So we'll select this option and we'll just enter in a password. Now unlike the default Windows 2003 domain configuration, this doesn't have to be a complex password, but of course it's always good security practice to use a good strong password. So we'll click on OK, and we can see that our backup has now been performed. So we'll click on Close. Now to back up IIS, we can fire up NT Backup by clicking on Start, All Programs, Accessories, System Tools, and then we'll click on Backup. Now NT Backup will start in wizard mode by default, so we'll simply click on Next. Now because we want to perform a backup, we'll leave the default setting here to back up some files and settings, and we'll choose Next. Now to perform a backup of IIS and our Metabase, we don't need to back up all information on our computer, so what we'll do is we'll select the second option, let me choose what to back up, and then we'll choose Next. Okay, now if we come over here to the left hand side and we expand My Computer, we'll select the System State option. Now the system state is covered in our videos on Windows Server 2003, but in a nutshell, it comprises of the system critical objects like the registry, Active Directory, the sys file containers, and of course the IIS Metabase. Now as it stands, we'll be backing up our IIS configuration, but we aren't yet backing up our actual content. So make sure that if you want to back up your IIS content as well, we'll expand our C drive, and then we'll select the inet pub directory as well. Now if you do happen to be storing your website content in a different folder, then just substitute this path with the path where you have your IIS content saved. Okay, so we've covered all of IIS including the Metabase, so what we'll do now is we'll click on Next, and then we need to tell NT Backup which backup media we want to use. Now in our case, we don't actually have any locally attached tape devices or CD jukeboxes or anything like that, so we only have the one default option of performing a file backup. But the next thing we need to do is provide a backup path. So we'll click on Browse, and then I'll just navigate to my desktop, and we'll save our backup there. Now the default backup file name is backup.bkf, but I'll change that to IIS, so it's a little more meaningful, and then I'll click on Save. And now we can see that our backup path and file name have changed to represent our choices. So we'll click Next, and we'll get a brief summary telling us that we're about to perform a backup to a file named IIS.bkf, the date when we created this backup, the contents of the backup are simply files and folders, and finally we're going to be doing a file backup. So if everything is okay, we'll click on Next, and then our backup will start using the volume shadow service, which will take a quick snapshot of any of the open files in our system and then back them up. Now this will take a few moments, so I'll pause the video and return once the backup has finished. Okay, so our backup's complete. Now you can view a report of what our backup did, or we can simply click on Close. Okay, so that's the process of backing up IIS in its entirety. Now let's take a look at restoring IIS and the Metabase. So what we'll need to do is do this in reverse, so we'll fire up NT Backup again. And as before, it will start in wizard mode, so we'll just click Next. Now this time we need to restore some files and settings, and we'll choose Next. Now because NT Backup maintains a catalogue of our backups, we can see the backup that we performed a moment ago on the left. So we'll expand File, and we can see our IIS backup. So we'll expand that. And we can see that this backup contains items from our C drive and our system state. So we'll select both of these, and we'll choose Next. Now we get our standard summary screen telling us that we're about to restore from a file backup, but the default is to not replace existing files. Now that might be okay if your original files have been deleted, but if they exist but are corrupted, then this might be no good to you. Now in the case of our system state, the system state will always overwrite any existing files regardless of whatever it says here. So if we need this restore operation to overwrite any existing files other than the system state, of course, what we'll do is we'll click on the Advanced button, and then in the drop down box we'll leave the default setting, which is to restore our files to the original location. We'll choose Next, and we just get a message that tells us that when we restore the system state backup, we'll always overwrite no matter what it says, and I just explained that before, so that's fine. So we'll just click on OK, and then we'll choose the bottom option, which is to replace any existing files. So we'll choose Next, and we'll just leave the defaults for this screen, which is to restore our security settings, any junction points, and to preserve the existing mount points, and we'll just choose Next. And now we're back to our summary screen, and when we choose Finish, our restore will start, overriding both our system state and our existing IIS directories. Now I'll just pause the video here again, and we'll return once our restore is complete. Okay, so our IIS content and system state has now been restored back to its rightful location. Now when we click on Close, we will be asked to restart our server, as the system state restore had to overwrite some critical Windows files. So I'll select Yes. I'll pause this video again, and then I'll resume once this server has been restarted. Okay, our server's been restarted, now restore is almost complete, but there's still one more thing that we need to do, and it involves the IIS MMC. We need to restore the Metabase. Now we actually have already restored the files associated with the Metabase in the restore we just performed a moment ago, but now we need to tell IIS to use this Metabase. So we'll start by opening up the IIS Manager by clicking on Start, Administrative Tools, and then launching the IIS MMC. And then we'll right click on our server, we'll select All Tasks, Backup Restore Configuration. And now we'll highlight our IIS Metabase backup, and then we'll click on Restore. Now we get a message telling us that this can take a while, as IIS has to delete our existing settings and then stop the internet services. So do we want to continue? Well, yes, or otherwise our IIS server restore won't be fully complete. So I'm going to click on Yes. Now in a few moments I will be asked to provide the password I entered when I created this backup. So I'll enter in the password now, and then I'll click on OK. Now once this has completed, which admittedly shouldn't take too long on our test server as we don't have too much content, our IIS server will be restored to full functionality. Alright, we're done. The operation completed successfully. So we'll click on OK, and now IIS and the Metabase is fully restored. So as you can see, backing up and restoring IIS is not a difficult task to perform. It just requires the additional Metabase step to ensure that everything is fully restored. Okay, now the next thing we should look at with regards to our Metabase is the security of the Metabase itself. Now, as I mentioned earlier, in order for you to make changes to the Metabase itself, you'll need to be a member of the local administrators group or have been delegated permission to modify these files. And this file access security is valid for the Metabase XML file, the MB schema.xml file, as well as the schema and Metabase history files as well. So we'll jump into our inetserv directory, which is located under our Windows system32/inetserv. And if we scroll down, we can see our metabase.xml and our MB schema.xml files. Now, a thing to point out about these files, as well as Windows providing access control list security, IIS also encrypts some of the values inside our Metabase files. So we'll open up our Metabase schema file, and I'll just expand this to make it a little bit easier to see. Now in here, to see for some of the encrypted values, we need to search for a property that has an attribute of secure. Now we're talking about something that's been encrypted in our Metabase XML file. So for example, if we take this line here with our admin ACL and we'll scroll all the way across here, and we can see its attributes is listed here with secure. So if we go back to our Metabase XML file, we'll right click and we'll open that with Notepad as well, and we'll just expand that. And I'll just come here and turn on word wrap to make it a little bit easier to see. And we can see here the same admin ACL property has this value here, which has been encrypted. Okay, aside from the default security option provided with the Metabase, there are of course some best practices that you should follow to ensure our Metabase is protected. First of all, make sure that you're using good complex passwords, and this really should go without saying. But if you're running your domain controllers on Windows 2003, then the default is to require passwords with at least 7 characters, and it must consist of a special character, an uppercase character, and a lowercase character. Next, don't change the access control list permission on the Metabase files and the history files if at all possible. They've already been locked down by default, and it's preferable that they're left that way. Next, it's recommended that you don't encrypt your Metabase files. Now I know you're asking if you heard that correctly. I'm telling you not to encrypt files? Well yes, actually I am. Now as strange as this one might sound, the critical data contained in these files is already encrypted. So encrypting the whole file might make you feel a bit better, but in reality it's only slowing down the performance of IIS. The next thing you should do is audit any administrators that are authorized to edit your Metabase XML files. That way you can identify who made changes to the file in the event that there's a problem. Now take note, this will only audit users who modify the file directly, not those users that use the IIS MMC, which runs as a local system account. Now if you want to be even more stringent, audit the WMI, the ADSI and the ABO tools, which can be used to script changes in IIS. That way you can identify which users ran those tools to assist in tracking down who's been making changes. Now you can also edit the IIS MMC by auditing the inet manager exe file, which is located in your system32/inetserv directory. Auditing access to files and folders is a really easy thing to do. If you're running in a domain environment, you'll first need to enable the auditing of object access as part of your domain security policy. And then it's a simple matter of right-clicking on the file, or the executable in this case, and selecting Properties. And then we'll select the Security tab, followed by the Advanced button. Then on the Auditing tab, we'll simply select Add, and then add in the user accounts or groups that we want to audit. Now the final thing is to make sure you regularly check your event logs, because that is also a good source of IIS error related information. Now specifically, you'll want to be on the lookout for events that range from IDs 1000 to 1131, and these are the events relating to the web service, and events ranging from 2201 to 2272 which relate to the core processes belonging to the web service. Okay, so that's the IIS Metabase. It's important to understand how the Metabase works when administering IIS 6, specifically because without a good solid backup and security plan in place, it can really spoil your weekend to find your IIS configuration corrupted or unexpectedly change, especially if you happen to be one of those few who suffer from the inability to produce good solid documentation. So make sure you back up your IIS Metabase regularly and make sure you implement a good Metabase security plan.